Hi, Bhagat. Thanks for joining today. The restive regions have obviously been declared as independent states by Putin himself to justify strengthening what is already a very pro-Russian rebel activist. It's been reported in the West, of course, that this is an invasion, giving the impression that they've waltzed into Kiev with hundreds of thousands of troops. Can you just throw a bit of sanity into what's occurring, please? Because the Western media clearly isn't presenting that to me.
Certainly, Paul. First and foremost, Paul, we need to discern what exactly is an invasion and what exactly is Russia doing. I would say Russia is playing according to their set pattern. They've used this playbook, as we have said it from the day one of the entire controversy started in our daily briefs. And according to the playbook, they basically support and pump money and arms into restive secessionist regions, which are fighting the nationalist forces in Ukraine. In this case, it is Luhansk and Donetsk. And using that as an excuse, they basically declare these controversial regions as independent, legitimizing moving in peacekeeping force, which are regular Russian military. Now, some analysts may actually question that, saying since 2014, since their popular revolution by kicking out pro-Russian president and bringing in pro-Western president, there has been fighting going on in this region. And what's new? Controversially, Russian forces have been involved in this region covertly. So what's new is that Russia is moving to legitimize their actions. And this is very much according to their playbook, what they used in Georgia, in South Ossetia region, and in Crimea. Only difference is that they were less upfront in Crimea, using the so-called little green men without arm patches to pressure in a referendum in favor of Russia. Of course, the West did not acknowledge Crimea joining Russia, but in this case, Putin has been quite upfront, and he has used a hard hand in going in for a unilateral declaration of independence of these two restive republics, Republic of Donetsk and Republic of Luhansk. Of course, Ukraine and the West call it an invasion, primarily because Ukraine considers Luhansk and Donetsk as integral part of the sovereign territory. But Russians, on the other hand, including pro-Russian ethnic groups in this region, they call themselves independent, or they favor joining Mother Russia since the Soviet times. So that's where the crux is, Paul.
And what about the UN's view on what are the boundaries of the Ukraine? And what is Ukraine's likely response to this? Is it to let them go? Is it to go and fight? Is it to escalate the fighting there? Where do you see this going? Now, obviously, since we've been covering this Ukraine-Russia situation, we've been stating there's not going to be an invasion of the Ukraine. We've been assuming people understand the historical context there of those restive regions. But where do you think it's going to go in terms of the UN's thoughts on this? Western pundits are going to continue to call this an invasion, and you can see their perspective on that, because their perspective will not take into consideration Russian sovereignty over those, Russians' ability to call them independent and then come in. Where do you think it's heading from here? And do you see a further invasion into the rest of the Ukraine being on the table?
Well, UN on its part has not recognized any separatist region as independent, and it is unlikely to recognize it either. And UN observes that the sovereign territory of Ukraine needs to be respected, and that so is the case with many UN member nations. Even countries which may be far removed from the region, like Kenya, have sounded out that territorial integrity is of paramount importance, especially for countries which are next to some of the giants like Russia. Now, As far as where it is going, we have already seen signs of escalating military operations along the borders, and Russia is claiming that there are casualties on Ukrainian side when they try to breach the borders along Donetsk and Luhansk. Though the entire region is not entirely in the hands of the separatists, the Ukrainian military still has presence in the region. So specifically in that region, I see escalation of tensions, escalation of military operations on both sides, and whether more parts of Ukraine can be claimed by Russia using Russian ethnic groups in the region, we cannot rule that out, because it depends on how concentrated are the ethnic Russians in these specific regions. For example, in Luhansk and Donetsk, majority of the ethnic groups on the ground are Russian. They were basically byproducts of the Soviet era. Now, the same can't be said about Odessa, for example, in the south and southeastern regions. So there is no foothold for Russia to move into these regions where there is no substantial presence of pro-Russian or Russian ethnic groups. So I do not see it escalating beyond that threshold, but we can't really rule out expansion of Russian interests in the region. This is basically a way to put pressure on the government in Ukraine to dance to Putin's tunes.
Putting another spin on it, obviously Macron, Putin gave him the respect he deserved in terms of the power he represents, which is very little. So we're in a very awkward position now that the West has been talking a good game, but it seems to have forgotten to bring its pace bowlers. It's kind of slapping around some pretty sloppy, soft pillows. We were saying right along that China and Russia, that's what they want to see. Is there any combined will? Is there anything left in the Western's bag other than rhetoric? What would you say about that?
Well, I would say Western shallow rhetorics have been exposed. Their diplomatic efforts have failed to a greater extent. And Macron, as well as some of the other foreign ministers of Western countries, have not been able to contain Russia's exhilarated move towards Luhansk and Donetsk. And on the West, in fact, on part of the West, they have not really come out with a comprehensive statement till yet. I mean, they are still saying there will be dire consequences for such a move, and they do not really seem to have an answer to Putin and his master plan. Because legally speaking, if they declare these two regions as independent republics, and these republics, though unrecognized, give open check or blank check to Putin to come in and protect these republics, they can't really say that this is invasion. This is separatist action, and Russian peacekeepers are there to ensure there's no further escalation of bloodshed. So the West is kind of tied up in their own knots, and that's exactly where their empty rhetorics and warmongering has been exposed by Putin and his master strategy.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of kerfluffling, but no substance. I mean, they're talking about it's going to be more sanctions, like whoopee-doopie. The only thing they really care about is actually those pipelines ultimately pumping oil and through to Germany. Sanctions are kind of insignificant compared to that. The West seems to have kept blowing up its own balloon until it's on the verge of popping, if it hasn't already popped after the Afghanistan debacle. But perhaps there should be a lesson for the West here to heed, and that is you can't control the world. Your values and your desires are yours. Precisely that, they're yours. They seem to be hell-bent on pushing their values and stretching their economic and military capabilities to a point where they're just way outside of their own backyard. I think there's going to be an interesting one to look at, because any sanctions that the West imposes are going to be countered by actions by China, which we see are getting more and more emboldened to strike back. And people are forgetting that on a purchasing parity basis, China is already the biggest economy by a long shot. And on a straight GDP value, it's not that far away either, but nobody seems to be readjusting. Seems particularly the Americans and their statesmen allies are incapable of perhaps reassessing relative financial purchasing power on the superpowers, and also how indebted America has been by overextending itself. So I think there's a lot of things for us to monitor here. I'm looking forward to reading your assessments for the next couple of weeks on all of EMEA, of course, but also especially on the Ukraine. Any final points to close off, Bhargav?
Certainly, Paul. I must agree with you on the whole, and we must reflect on what happened with the sanctions back in 2008 when they waltzed into Georgia, basically to protect South Ossetia from the Tbilisi government, and what happened in 2014 as well as in Crimea. What did the economic sanctions yield? They were shallow and they were empty, and Putin continued to be Putin even after that. And we have seen the result now in eastern Ukraine. So with that, I will just underline that the West seems to be out of its depth with lack of leadership, both from the US as well as in Europe.
And I'd also say a lack of unity. There's just too many people wanting to have meetings, but there's too many eloquent spokesmen in them without a real understanding of all the things they're stating and what impacts they will or won't have. And I'm referring to overuse of sanctions and blah, blah associated with imposing stronger sanctions and using colourful words like there will be a very strong response, but there's actually been no response. Of course, then you've got the UN, which is infamously famous at doing everything way too late. So, again, a lesson in this that if you're continuing to base all your risk assessments globally on the mystical belief that the West and America have are a superior power and have superior coverage, then you perhaps need to reblend your risk team with some outside thinking. All right, Bhargav, thanks a lot. Really appreciate your time on an ad hoc call like this. Cheers.
Thanks, Paul.